Scorpio and Taurus don't meet by accident. They sit opposite each other on the zodiac for a reason. This is the axis of desire and survival. One needs emotional depth to feel alive. The other needs stability to feel safe. When they connect, it doesn't feel like romance. It feels like attachment. And once that bond forms, it's very hard to break. What forms between them isn't emotion, it's nervous system recognition. And if you've been trying to understand why you couldn't move on from a Scorpio Taurus connection, let's look at what's actually happening beneath the surface. Chapter 1: Why This Axis Feels Fated. Scorpio and Taurus don't experience each other as a choice. They experience each other as recognition, not because they're similar, but because they're solving the same problem from opposite ends. This axis governs survival. Taurus asks, how do I stay safe in the world? Scorpio asks, how do I stay emotionally alive? When these two meet, something clicks beneath conscious thought. The body registers familiarity before the mind can label it. This is why the connection often feels inevitable, not romantic, not exciting, but anchoring and destabilizing at the same time. Taurus feels Scorpio as intensity that gives meaning to comfort. Scorpio feels Taurus as stability that makes intensity survivable. They're not drawn to each other's personality, they're drawn to what the other regulates. That's what makes this axis dangerous, because once someone regulates your nervous system, they become very hard to replace. Chapter 2: Why This Connection Becomes Addictive. Scorpio-Taurus connections don't deepen gradually, they escalate. Not because either sign is reckless, but because the bond forms at the level of regulation. Taurus stabilizes through consistency, touch, and physical presence. Scorpio stabilizes through emotional intensity and psychological closeness. When they connect, each becomes the other's anchor in a different way. Scorpio feels calmer with Taurus, less chaotic, less reactive. The nervous system slows down. For someone used to emotional extremes, that kind of grounding feels rare. Taurus, on the other hand, feels activated, more alive, more awake. Scorpio introduces depth, urgency, and meaning into a life that values predictability. What once felt safe can suddenly feel flat without that intensity. This is where addiction begins. Not because of drama and not because of obsession in the stereotypical sense, but because each person becomes a regulator for something the other struggles to self-generate. Taurus regulates safety. Scorpio regulates depth. Once that loop is established, separation doesn't feel like heartbreak. It feels like withdrawal. The body looks for the other person to return to baseline. This is why Scorpio-Taurus bonds are so difficult to let go of, even when the relationship itself is no longer functional. The attachment isn't emotional, it's physiological. And because neither sign moves quickly once attached, the bond tends to sink deeper over time. Rather than burnout, this axis doesn't create chaos, it creates dependence. That's the part people don't talk about, and it's why this connection can feel impossible to replace. Chapter 3: Taurus, the anchor Scorpio, becomes attached to. Taurus doesn't pursue Scorpio through intensity. Taurus attracts through presence. There is something deeply regulating about Taurus energy. It's steady, predictable, and embodied. Taurus moves through the world slowly, deliberately, and with a strong sense of continuity. For Scorpio, who often lives in emotional extremes, this steadiness feels like relief. Taurus offers Scorpio something rare, a nervous system that doesn't escalate under pressure. When Scorpio becomes emotionally activated, Taurus tends to stay grounded. They don't rush to fix, analyze, or interrogate. They remain, and that constancy creates safety. This is where Scorpio's attachment begins. Not because Taurus overwhelms them, but because Taurus doesn't disappear. Scorpio is used to intensity creating connection. With Taurus, connection is created through consistency. Over time, that consistency becomes irreplaceable. Taurus also anchors Scorpio in the physical world. through routine, through shared spaces, through touch, through the repetition of ordinary life. For a sign that often lives internally, this embodiment is grounding in a way that feels stabilizing rather than limiting. But Taurus attachment is quiet. They don't dramatize their loyalty, they demonstrate it. And Scorpio, who reads behavior more than words, notices. The danger is that Taurus can become the emotional baseline Scorpio relies on without realizing it. Taurus becomes the place Scorpio goes to regulate, rest, and reset. And once someone becomes your anchor, the idea of losing them doesn't feel like loss. It feels like destabilization. This is why Scorpio can struggle to detach from Taurus long after the relationship has changed. The bond wasn't formed through excitement, it was formed through safety, and safety, once established, is very difficult to give up. Chapter 4, Scorpio, the depth Taurus didn't know they needed. Scorpio doesn't enter Taurus's life gently, they enter it deeply. Where Taurus values continuity, Scorpio introduces disruption, not chaos for its own sake, but emotional depth that exposes what's been buried beneath comfort and routine. Taurus often doesn't realize what's missing until Scorpio arrives. Life may feel stable, productive, even successful, but Scorpio asks different questions. Questions that don't have practical answers, questions that force emotional honesty. Scorpio sees beneath Taurus's calm exterior. They sense unspoken desires, suppressed fears, and emotional material that Taurus prefers to manage quietly. And instead of avoiding it, Scorpio leans in. For Taurus, this can feel unsettling at first. Scorpio's intensity challenges their preference for emotional simplicity, but over time, that intensity begins to feel meaningful. Scorpio brings urgency into Taurus's emotional world, a sense that life is not just about maintaining what works, but about confronting what's real. This can awaken parts of Taurus that have been dormant for years. Emotionally, Scorpio makes Taurus feel seen in a way they didn't know they needed, not admired, not validated, but recognized. That recognition creates attachment. Taurus begins to associate Scorpio with depth, meaning, and emotional truth. Life without Scorpio can start to feel quieter, flatter, less vivid. But Scorpio's depth is not always gentle. Their emotional insight can feel invasive when Taurus isn't ready to be exposed. What Scorpio experiences as intimacy, Taurus can experience as pressure. This is where the axis becomes volatile, because once Taurus bonds to depth, they can't unfeel it. Scorpio has already changed the emotional landscape, and Taurus, who rarely lets people in, finds themselves attached not just to a person, but to a version of themselves that only existed in Scorpio's presence. Chapter 5, Control, Possession, and the Power Struggle on this axis. Scorpio and Taurus are opposites, and opposites create tension. Not conflict for its own sake, but a subtle, ongoing negotiation of power. Taurus exerts control through presence, through consistency, through being irreplaceable. Their stability becomes a silent claim. They don't need to demand attention. Attention naturally follows. Scorpio exerts control differently through emotional insight, through withdrawal, through knowing what buttons to press without saying a word. They influence without force. They test, observe, and measure. Both forms of control are unconscious. Both are born from fear, fear of loss, fear of instability, fear of being unseen. The problem arises when attachment runs ahead of consciousness. Taurus becomes possessive without realizing it. Scorpio becomes manipulative without intending to. Neither wants to hurt the other, but both are operating from a place of survival rather than choice. This is why the Scorpio-Taurus bond can feel addictive and volatile at the same time. There's a magnetic pull that's hard to resist, but there's also a tension that feels inescapable. In healthy alignment, power is balanced. Taurus provides grounding, Scorpio provides depth. Control becomes mutual regulation. In shadow alignment, the bond turns into a psychological chess match. Both parties test boundaries, both monitor responses, both resist surrendering fully. The lesson of this axis is never about domination, it's about recognition. Recognizing when to lead, when to follow, when to hold steady, when to let intensity sweep through, and understanding that the most potent attachments are rarely balanced. They are deeply uneven, yet neither party can fully detach without feeling destabilized. Chapter 6: Sex, Bonding, and the Body Soul Connection. Scorpio and Taurus connect on a level that bypasses words. Taurus experiences the world through the body, through touch, through routine, through shared space. Physical presence is the language they speak. Security, loyalty, attachment, all of it flows through the senses. Scorpio experiences the world through intensity, through emotion, through energy. They bond by penetrating the unseen layers of the psyche, by exposing what others cannot see. When these two meet, the connection becomes both grounding and transformative. Sex is not merely pleasure, it is ritual. It is a way to anchor intensity into the body. Scorpio introduces depth, urgency, and vulnerability. Taurus receives it and translates it into constancy, safety, and presence. Outside the bedroom, this bond continues through daily interactions, small gestures, consistent attention, and the subtle awareness of each other's rhythms build a sense of mutual regulation. But this connection is not always comfortable. For Taurus, Scorpio's depth can feel exposing, overwhelming, or invasive. For Scorpio, Taurus's steadiness can feel slow, resistant, or unresponsive. The interplay between intensity and stability is addictive. It is not just emotional or physical, it is physiological. The nervous system learns to anticipate the other. The body remembers the closeness. Even after absence, the memory of that presence lingers. This is why breakups on this axis feel like withdrawal. The loss is not only emotional, it is somatic. The bond between Scorpio and Taurus is a constant negotiation between depth and safety, chaos and calm. It is a connection that imprints on both the soul and the body, creating attachment that lingers long after words, gestures, or even proximity disappear. Chapter 7: Why They Can't Forget Each Other. Once a Scorpio-Taurus connection forms, it leaves an imprint that is difficult to erase. This is not sentimental. It is not about longing or nostalgia. It is about the body and mind recognizing a bond that regulated and activated them in ways no one else could. Taurus remembers security, the calm that made intensity survivable, the routines and presence that made life predictable yet meaningful. Scorpio remembers depth, the emotional intensity that made stability feel alive, the vulnerability that made the ordinary extraordinary. Even after separation, both carry the other as a reference point. Their nervous systems expect it. Their bodies anticipate it, their minds replay it. This is why Scorpio-Taurus breakups often feel impossible. It is not just heartache, it is withdrawal. A recalibration is required that can take months or even years. Attachment on this axis is both conscious and unconscious. The mind may tell them to move on, to replace the connection, to close the chapter, but the body and psyche resist. Even subtle reminders, a scent, a gesture, a place, can reignite the recognition. They do not need to see each other to feel the pull. It is embedded in memory, energy, and emotion. The connection transcends circumstance. It persists because it formed at the level of regulation, at the point where stability met intensity. No other relationship in their lives may feel this way. Not because it was perfect, not because it lasted, but because it became a template for what attachment, safety, and intensity feel like together. And once the template exists, it cannot be forgotten. For Scorpio and Taurus, the imprint is permanent. It lingers long after endings, long after distance, long after time has passed. Chapter 8, The Shadow Side of the Axis. The Scorpio-Taurus axis becomes destructive when attachment replaces awareness. At its shadow level, both signs begin operating from fear rather than presence. Taurus resists change. What once felt like loyalty turns into rigidity. They hold on longer than is healthy, not because the relationship still nourishes them, but because letting go threatens their sense of security. Scorpio, sensing that resistance, intensifies. What began as depth becomes pressure. Emotional insight turns into testing. Silence becomes a tool. Control replaces vulnerability. Neither side intends harm. Both are attempting to preserve the bond in the only way they know how. This is where the axis can slide into power struggles. Taurus tightens their grip through routine, expectation, and emotional shutdown. Scorpio tightens theirs through withdrawal, emotional escalation, and psychological influence. The bond becomes heavy. At this stage, the connection no longer regulates the nervous system, it destabilizes it. Taurus feels invaded, Scorpio feels blocked. Resentment grows, but neither wants to be the one who lets go. Ending the bond feels like annihilation, so both stay locked in patterns that erode trust. This is the danger of this axis when unconscious. The attachment is so strong that it overrides self-preservation. Without awareness, love turns into endurance. But the shadow is not a punishment, it is a signal. This axis demands maturity. It demands emotional responsibility. It requires both signs to learn that safety cannot come at the cost of autonomy and depth cannot come at the cost of peace. When Scorpio and Taurus refuse to evolve, the bond consumes them. When they choose awareness, the bond transforms. And that choice determines whether this axis becomes a lifelong foundation or a lesson that had to end. Chapter 9, When Scorpio and Taurus Meet at Their Highest Level. At its highest level, the Scorpio-Taurus axis is no longer about survival. It becomes about choice. Taurus learns that safety does not require control, that stability can coexist with emotional risk. Letting change in does not mean losing ground. Scorpio learns that depth does not require intensity at all times, that intimacy can exist without testing, that peace does not dilute connection. When both signs mature, attachment transforms into devotion. Taurus provides a foundation that is flexible rather than rigid. Their consistency becomes a place Scorpio can return to, not a structure that confines them. They learn to hold space without holding too tightly. Scorpio brings depth without disruption. Emotional honesty replaces pressure. Vulnerability replaces power. They learn that trust does not have to be earned through crisis. In this expression, the axis regulates rather than destabilizes. Safety and intensity no longer compete. They support each other. The bond becomes steady, deep, and resilient. Not because it avoids difficulty, but because it no longer fears it. This is where Scorpio and Taurus stop reacting to each other and start choosing each other. The addictive pull softens. What remains is loyalty, emotional honesty, and a shared rhythm that feels sustainable rather than consuming. Few connections reach this level. It requires self-awareness, emotional accountability, and the willingness to grow beyond instinct. But when it does happen, this axis creates one of the most enduring bonds in astrology. Not loud, not dramatic, not obsessive, grounded, intimate, devoted. And unlike its shadow form, this version of the Scorpio-Taurus bond doesn't demand everything at once. It lasts. Chapter 10. Who feels this axis most strongly? Not everyone experiences the Scorpio-Taurus axis with the same intensity. This bond becomes most potent when it activates personal planets or foundational points in the chart. People with Scorpio or Taurus suns often feel it immediately, but the deeper pull usually comes from the moon, Venus, Mars, or the ascendant. These placements govern attachment, desire, and instinctual response. Moon contacts are especially powerful. When one person's moon falls in Scorpio or Taurus and the other activates it, the bond forms at the level of emotional regulation. Comfort, safety, and intensity become intertwined. Venus and Mars contacts add magnetism and sexual imprinting. These are the placements that make the connection difficult to forget, even when it was brief. House overlays matter just as much. When Scorpio and Taurus activate the second and eighth houses, the relationship centers on security, resources, emotional merging, and vulnerability. These connections rarely feel casual. Pluto aspects intensify everything. Pluto to Venus, Moon, or the ascendant deepens attachment and increases the sense of inevitability. This is where obsession, fixation, and long term imprinting appear. Synastry between Scorpio and Taurus doesn't always look dramatic on paper. What makes it powerful is repetition, tight oppositions, multiple contacts, the same themes echoing across the chart. This is not an axis that announces itself loudly, it embeds itself quietly. People often don't realize how deeply they're affected until they try to move on. And that's the signature of this axis. If you've lived it, you don't need it explained. You recognize it immediately. Closing, the truth about Scorpio and Taurus. Scorpio and Taurus don't teach romance, they teach attachment. They ask whether intensity can exist without control, whether safety can exist without stagnation. When unconscious, this axis becomes addictive. When conscious, it becomes devoted. And the difference between the two is awareness. If this connection has marked you, it wasn't random, it was formative. Because some bonds aren't meant to be light, they're meant to change how you attach forever, quietly, permanently.